The morning sun had just begun its climb, pouring streaks of gold across the dusty training field. The air was thick with heat, though the day had barely started. Rows of recruits stood stiff in formation, sweat already trickling down their temples. Their boots scuffed the dirt, sending faint clouds rising with every twitch and shift of restless legs. It was the kind of morning where the air itself seemed to demand discipline unyielding, harsh and heavy. The sergeant walked among them like a wolf patrolling his territory. His boots struck the ground with a rhythm that echoed louder than it should have, each step reminding the recruits who owned this patch of earth. His eyes, sharp and unforgiving, scanned the line as if daring someone to falter. A few recruits averted their gaze, afraid to catch his eye, but one did not. She stood near the center of the row, a young woman, lean but wiry, her jaw set tight. Her uniform clung to her shoulders, already stained by sweat, yet her posture betrayed no weakness. She stared straight ahead, lips pressed into a thin line, refusing to blink even when the sun's glare hit her directly in the face. The sergeant noticed. He stopped pacing. Dust swirled around his boots as silence thickened across the yard. He turned his full attention toward her, his head tilting slightly, like a predator spotting prey. "You," he barked, his voice cutting the air like a whip. "Step forward." The recruits froze. No one dared to breathe too loudly. She obeyed, stepping forward with a crisp movement, though her pulse thundered in her ears. She felt every eye burning into her back. The sergeant circled her slowly, hands clasped behind him. His shadow fell across her face, stretching long in the morning light. "Name," he demanded. "Recruit Daniels, sir," she answered, her voice steady, though her throat felt dry as sand. "Daniels." He spat the name like it was a bad taste. "Tell me, Daniels, what makes you think you belong here?" The question wasn't asked out of curiosity. It was a challenge, a loaded grenade tossed at her feet. Around them, the recruits stiffened further, waiting for her to make a mistake. She swallowed hard. "Because I can endure, sir." The sergeant chuckled, but there was no humor in it. His laugh was sharp, like gravel underfoot. "Endure?" he repeated, drawing out the word. "You think this place is about endurance? No, this place is about strength, about dominance, about proving that you are harder than the world outside these gates. And looking at you?" He paused, stepping closer until she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. "I don't see strength." A ripple of discomfort passed through the recruits. Some shifted nervously. Others pitied her already. But Daniels did not look away. She held her ground. "With respect, sir," she said, her voice quiet but unwavering. "Strength comes in many forms." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. That flicker of defiance. It was small, but it was there. And he despised it. He raised his voice so all could hear. "You hear that?" He turned to the line of recruits. "She thinks strength comes in many forms. Do you believe that?" No one answered. Silence was safer than agreement or denial. The sergeant's gaze snapped back to her. "Let me show you what real strength looks like." Without warning, he barked, "Push-ups." "Now, until I tell you to stop." Daniels dropped instantly, her palms striking the dirt. She began the motion, her body rigid, arms bending and straightening with precision. The dust rose with every push, clinging to her sweat. The other recruits stared, relief flooding them. It wasn't them under his spotlight. "Count them out loud," the sergeant ordered. 1, 2, 3. Her voice rang out with each rep. He prowled around her, watching like a hawk. "Louder, I can't hear you." 4, 5. "Psi X." Her throat burned, but she raised her volume. By 30, her arms trembled. By 40, her lungs were screaming. Yet she pushed on, her voice ragged but unbroken. The sergeant crouched beside her, his face inches from hers. "You'll break," he said softly, so only she could hear. "They always do." Her arms threatened to give out. Her muscles screamed in rebellion. But she ground her teeth and spat the next number through clenched jaws. 51. Something in his expression faltered for the briefest second, a flicker of surprise. The recruits whispered among themselves. Some had already lost count. She kept going. Finally, the sergeant snapped. "On your feet." She rose, chest heaving, face streaked with sweat and dust. She swayed slightly, but stood tall, chin lifted. The sergeant studied her in silence. The yard was dead quiet, every recruit waiting for his verdict. Then he smirked, a cruel twist of lips. "Not bad, Daniels. Not bad. But let's see how well you endure when the ground welcomes you." Her heart skipped. She barely had time to brace before his hand struck her shoulder hard, sending her sprawling back into the dirt. The breath rushed from her lungs as she hit the ground. Gasps rippled through the recruits. The sergeant towered over her. "That's your place," he declared. "Down there, weak, small. Remember it." Daniels lay still for a heartbeat, dust filling her mouth, her pride burning hotter than the sun above. She could have stayed down, many would have. But inside her, something flared. She pressed her palms against the dirt. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed herself up, first to her knees, then to her feet. Her legs shook. Her uniform was filthy, but she stood, straight, silent, defiant. The recruit's eyes widened. Whispers ran through the line. The sergeant's smirk faltered. Daniels brushed the dirt from her cheek and fixed her gaze on him. She said nothing, but the message was clear. "You can throw me down, but you cannot keep me there." And in that moment, the drill ground itself seemed to hold its breath. The dust still clung to Daniels's uniform as she stood in formation once more, her chest rising and falling with each labored breath. She had been thrown down, humiliated before everyone, yet she had risen again. Her silent defiance had unsettled the sergeant, though his face betrayed nothing but stern authority. Around them, the recruits shifted uneasily, their minds replaying the moment over and over. Some admired her courage. Others feared for her, knowing that defiance, silent or spoken, was not something a man like Sergeant Keller would let pass. Keller's boots crunched against the dirt as he resumed pacing, his jaw clenched tight. His reputation had been built on breaking recruits, grinding them down until nothing remained but obedience. He prided himself on sniffing out weakness, exploiting it, hammering it, until the body bent or the spirit shattered. But Daniels, she hadn't broken. Not yet. And that gnawed at him. He stopped abruptly, his glare pinning her like a nail. "Daniels," he barked. "Yes, sir." Her voice rang out, sharp despite the soreness in her throat. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across her boots. "Tell me," he said slowly, his words sharp as a blade, "do you think this place is a game? That this," he jabbed a finger toward the recruits, "is some kind of stage where you get to show off your little display of courage?" "No, sir." Her reply was clipped, professional. "Then why?" Keller hissed, his voice dropping low. "Do you stand there like you've already proven something?" The recruits held their breath. They could sense the invisible rope tightening between them, a test of willpower that went beyond drills or endurance. Daniels didn't flinch. "Because I have nothing to prove, sir. Only something to become." For the first time, a murmur ran through the line. It was dangerous, perhaps reckless, to answer like that. Yet her words weren't rebellious. They carried no arrogance, only conviction. Keller's lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "Something to become? You think the Army cares about your dreams, Daniels? The Army cares about obedience, about order, about soldiers who follow without hesitation. He stepped so close now that his breath brushed her ear. "And I'll make sure you understand that before I'm done with you." He pulled back sharply, voice rising again for all to hear. Front and center. Daniels jogged forward, planting herself before him, spine straight. "Drop your pack," Keller ordered. She obeyed, letting the heavy rucksack thud onto the dirt. "Pick it up." She bent, slung it back over her shoulders. "Drop it again." The rucksack hit the ground once more, sending up a puff of dust. "Pick it up." The recruits exchanged nervous glances. This was no exercise, it was punishment. And Keller's eyes burned with determination to grind her resolve to ash. Daniels lifted the ruck, her arms aching from the endless push-ups earlier. "Drop it." The thud echoed again. Sweat stung her eyes, but she blinked it away. "Pick it up." On and on it went. Drop, lift, drop, lift. Her breath grew ragged, shoulders trembling under the weight. By the 10th repetition, her back screamed. By the 15th, her vision blurred at the edges. Still, she obeyed each command, her lips tight, her eyes forward. "Enough." Keller barked at last. The recruits nearly sagged in relief, though they hadn't moved an inch. Daniel stood swaying slightly under the pack, dirt streaking her face, her chest heaving. Keller tilted his head, studying her like a craftsman inspecting flawed material. He wanted to see cracks, fear, resentment, surrender, but what he saw instead unsettled him. Quiet endurance. She hadn't argued, hadn't resisted. She had done exactly as he ordered, yet somehow she had kept her dignity intact. "Take a lap," he commanded suddenly. "Full perimeter. Pack stays on." Daniels didn't hesitate. She broke into a jog, boots pounding the ground, the rucksack bouncing heavily against her spine. The perimeter of the training field stretched wide, and the heat bore down mercilessly. Dust clogged her throat with every breath. Her arms tingled, her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to keep moving. The recruits watched in silence as she disappeared around the far side of the field, her silhouette shimmering in the heat waves. Some felt sympathy, others envy. None could deny the strange pull she had on their attention. Minutes dragged by. Sweat soaked her uniform, dripping down her back. Each step jarred her bones, but her mind narrowed to a single mantra: endure, endure. When she finally rounded the last bend and staggered back into formation, Keller was waiting. His expression gave nothing away. "Time?" he asked one of the assistants. 6 minutes, 42 seconds, sir." Keller grunted. "Could be worse. Could be better." He eyed her closely. She stood gasping, her face pale, yet she had finished. She had not collapsed. She had not begged. The recruits glanced at one another. The air felt charged, as though something invisible had shifted. Keller's voice thundered again. "You think endurance makes you special, Daniels? It doesn't. You want to prove yourself here. You'll bleed like the rest. You'll crawl. You'll suffer. Because discipline isn't just about how long you can last. It's about how quickly you obey." His words cut deep. To him, her strength was irrelevant if it wasn't paired with submission. Yet Daniels only nodded, her chest still rising and falling like a drumbeat. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. For a moment, their eyes locked. It wasn't defiance she showed him, it was resilience. And that was something Keller hadn't faced in years. He felt it like a stone in his boot, irritating and impossible to ignore. He turned away sharply. Formation. Back in line. The recruits snapped to position. Daniels moved with them, sliding back into her spot. Her arms ached, her lungs burned, but her spirit burned hotter still. She had endured the weight he forced upon her, but more than that, she had endured the weight of his gaze, his disdain, his relentless push for her to crack. And though the morning sun still blazed, and though sweat and dust clung to her like chains, Daniels knew something vital. She had not been broken. Not yet. And Sergeant Keller knew it too. The heat had grown merciless as the day dragged on. The recruits' shadows shrank under the noon sun, sharp silhouettes cut into the dust. Sweat stained their uniforms, boots scuffed the ground, and fatigue weighed heavy on every chest. Yet the one who bore the most weight was Daniels, not from heat or drills, but from the sergeant's unrelenting focus. Sergeant Keller had been watching her since the lap. His sharp eyes never lingered long enough for others to notice, but Daniels felt it. Every step, every breath, every twitch of her muscles seemed to echo beneath his scrutiny. It wasn't just discipline now, it was personal. The recruits had fallen into silence, aware of the growing storm. They stood straighter, hoping invisibility might spare them. But deep down, they knew Keller had found his target, and until she broke, none of them were safe from the backlash of his temper. Daniels! His voice cracked the silence like a whip. She snapped to attention, exhaustion buried under reflex. Yes, sir. He strode toward her, his boots pounding against the packed dirt. When he stopped in front of her, the air thickened with tension. You think you're tough, don't you? He growled. No, sir, she replied quickly, though her heart raced. Don't lie to me, Daniels. You've been standing here all morning with that fire in your eyes. That stubborn little flame you think makes you strong. He leaned close, voice dropping to a venomous whisper. But I promise you, girl, I can snuff it out. The words coiled around her spine like a snake. Fear threatened to creep in, but she swallowed it. She would not let him see weakness. Sir, I'm here to follow orders, she said, her voice even. Oh, you'll follow them, Keller snapped, straightening. You'll follow them until your body begs you to quit. He turned sharply to the formation. Circle up, now. The recruits scrambled, forming a wide ring around the two of them. The air buzzed with anticipation and dread. They knew what this meant. Keller wasn't testing her anymore. He was about to make an example of her. Keller's voice thundered. The army is built on one truth. The weak don't survive. You see this recruit? He pointed at Daniels, his finger like a dagger. She thinks she can stand tall in my yard. She thinks endurance means she belongs. Let me show you what happens to those who think defiance is strength. Daniel's stomach churned, but she locked her knees, staring straight ahead. Ground. Keller barked. She dropped into a push-up position instantly, arms trembling from the earlier punishment. 100. Keller roared. She bit back a groan and began. Dust rose with each motion, clinging to her sweat. Her arms screamed, her back strained, but she counted aloud with every rep. 1, 2, 3. Her voice carried, hoarse yet determined. By 30, her arms quivered. By 50, her breaths came ragged. At 70, the dirt beneath her palms blurred with tears she refused to shed. Keller crouched beside her, his face inches away. You'll quit. They always do. 81. She gasped. Her body shook violently, but she refused to collapse. 82. The recruits whispered among themselves, their faces etched with disbelief. No one had seen a recruit endure this long under Keller's wrath. Finally, at 97, her arms buckled, and she collapsed into the dirt. Her chest heaved, dust clouding around her face. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Keller's smirk widened. There it is, he announced, his voice triumphant. The breaking point. But Daniels wasn't done. With a guttural cry, she pushed against the ground, forcing her trembling body back up. Her arms wobbled, her vision swam, but she lifted herself enough to choke out. 98. Gasps echoed around the circle. 99? Her voice cracked, but the number cut through the yard. Keller's smirk faltered. 100. She collapsed again, this time on her side, chest heaving like she'd run for miles. Sweat soaked her uniform, and dust streaked her face. But she had done it. She had finished. The recruits exchanged stunned glances, their silence heavy with awe. Keller's face darkened. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. He had cornered her, pushed her to the edge, and still she hadn't surrendered. His pride burned hotter than the sun above them. He barked, "On your feet." Daniels forced herself up, legs trembling, arms useless at her sides. Her body screamed for rest, but her spine straightened as if pulled by invisible strings. She stood before him, battered yet unbroken. Keller's eyes bored into hers. For a moment, the world shrank to just the two of them, the predator and the prey who refused to die. He wanted to see fear, but instead he found defiance quiet, steady, unyielding. The recruits felt it too. They didn't see a broken soldier. They saw a fighter who had pushed beyond what anyone thought possible. In their eyes, she was no longer just another recruit. She was something else entirely. Keller's jaw clenched. He couldn't back down. Not now, not in front of them. His authority depended on it. Without warning, he shoved her shoulder hard, sending her crashing back into the dirt. The thud echoed across the field. Gasps rippled again through the circle. Daniels lay there, dust rising around her. Her body begged her to stay down. Her lungs screamed. Her arms were useless. Every instinct told her to surrender. But surrender was death. She pressed her palms against the ground. Inch by inch, with every muscle trembling, she rose. First to her knees, then to her feet. Dust streaked her face, sweat dripped from her chin, but her eyes burned brighter than ever. The recruits leaned forward, breath caught in their throats. Keller froze. She brushed the dirt from her cheek, slow and deliberate, and locked her gaze on him. Her silence was louder than any scream, sharper than any insult. And in that silence, Keller felt the sting of humiliation. He had thrown her into the dirt, but she had risen. He had declared her broken, but she had endured. And though he still stood above her in rank, in that moment, the recruits didn't see him as the victor. They saw her. And that was the true breaking point, not hers, but his. The field lay silent, except for the hum of cicadas and the pounding of blood in Daniel's ears. Dust clung to her lips, the bitter taste of dirt and sweat mingling on her tongue. Her body begged her to stay down, to surrender, to let gravity win. Every nerve screamed. Her arms trembled violently, her chest heaved, and her vision blurred around the edges. The sergeant loomed above her, arms folded, his shadow cutting across her sprawled form. His lips curled in a cruel smirk. "There it is," Keller said, his voice low and triumphant. The end of that flame. But something deep inside Daniels, something stronger than muscle, stronger than pride refused. Not like this. She pressed her palms into the dirt. It was rough and unyielding, stones biting into her skin, but she pushed anyway. Her arms wobbled. Her shoulders threatened to give out. The weight of the entire training yard pressed down on her spine. Slowly, painfully, she forced herself to her knees. The recruits leaned forward, breath caught. No one spoke. They didn't dare. Keller's smirk faltered. Daniels planted one foot, then the other, and rose to her feet. Her uniform was filthy, streaked with sweat and dust, her hair plastered to her forehead. Yet when she straightened her back, when she lifted her chin, she seemed taller than before. A hush fell across the circle. Daniels raised her eyes and locked them onto Keller's. They weren't wild with anger, nor dulled by defeat. They burned with something else, something dangerous. Silent defiance. Quiet strength. A fire that couldn't be smothered, no matter how many times she was thrown down. The sergeant shifted his weight. For a brief, fleeting second, he was no longer in control. Daniels didn't speak. She didn't need to. The dirt streaked across her face was proof enough of the battle she had fought and won. Her silence carried a message sharper than any words. You can throw me down, but you cannot keep me there. The recruits knew it too. They felt it ripple through the air, a current of energy that passed from soldier to soldier. Eyes that had once watched her with pity now glimmered with respect. Even admiration. Keller's jaw tightened. His pride burned. He had thrown everything at her: pain, humiliation, exhaustion, and still she rose. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. He was the storm, the hammer, the force of nature that crushed defiance. Yet here she stood, a single figure unbent in the face of it all. His voice snapped, sharp and cutting. Back in line, Daniels. Yes, sir, she answered, steady as stone. She moved with purpose, slipping back into formation, her posture tall despite the ache in her body. The other recruits straightened instinctively, as though her resilience had lent them strength too. But Keller wasn't finished. Eyes front. He barked at the group. Don't think for 1 second that what you just saw was victory. Discipline isn't about standing back up. It's about not falling in the first place. Remember that. His words rang out, but they lacked the same power as before. The recruits nodded, but their eyes betrayed them. They weren't looking at him with fear anymore. They were looking at her with something far more dangerous: belief. Keller saw it, and his stomach twisted. He turned sharply on his heel, pacing the circle again, boots crunching against the dirt. This is not a game, he roared. This is not about pride. Out there, he jabbed a finger toward the horizon, toward the world beyond the training yard. Out there, hesitation means death. Out there, your enemies won't let you rise. They'll put you down and make sure you stay there. His voice boomed, but it was as though the recruits heard only half of it. The other half was drowned out by the unspoken truth standing among them. Someone had risen. Daniels felt every ache in her body, every sting of gravel embedded in her palms, every ounce of weight dragging against her muscles. And yet, she also felt something else, something stronger than pain. Control, not of the sergeant, not of the recruits, but of herself. The dirt no longer clung to her like humiliation. It marked her like armor. She had faced the ground, kissed it with defeat, and stood again. That act alone had changed the air of the yard, shifted the balance of power in a way no one dared admit aloud. Keller knew it too. That's why his pacing was sharper now, his orders more clipped, his smirk forced. He had wanted to make an example of her. Instead, she had become one, but not in the way he intended. The recruits held their rifles tighter, their stances firmer. They weren't thinking about Keller's authority anymore. They were thinking about resilience. About Daniels. About rising. Daniels said nothing. She didn't gloat, didn't smile, didn't let victory show on her face. She simply stood in silence, her chest still heaving, but her spirit calm. It wasn't arrogance that kept her head high. It was resolve. In that silence, the lesson hung heavier than Keller's words. Falling doesn't matter. Rising does. For the rest of the drill, Keller pushed them harder. He barked commands with renewed ferocity, determined to reassert his dominance. Burpees, sprints, crawling through dust, he ordered it all. The recruits obeyed, bodies straining under the weight of exhaustion. Daniels pushed herself through each command, her body screaming but her will unbroken. And though Keller tried, though he barked louder and demanded more, he couldn't erase what they had all seen. By the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The recruits were spent. Their uniforms clung to them, their muscles shook, and their faces were streaked with dirt. Keller dismissed them at last, his voice gruff, his eyes avoiding Daniels more than once. The recruits broke formation, staggering toward the barracks. Some glanced at Daniels, nodding subtly, their respect silent but undeniable. She returned no nods, spoke no words. She simply walked with them, steady despite her exhaustion. Behind her, Keller stood alone on the training field, his jaw clenched, his hands tight at his sides. He told himself it was nothing, just another day, another stubborn recruit who hadn't learned her place yet. But deep down, a truth gnawed at him. He had thrown her into the dirt, and she had risen. And in rising, she had humiliated him not with words, not with rebellion, but with the one thing he couldn't crush, her will. The next morning arrived with a haze of heat that clung to the training yard like a shroud. The recruits shuffled into formation, their bodies sore from the previous day's punishment. Dust puffed beneath boots, rifles clattered into place, and the air filled with that familiar, heavy silence. Yet something unspoken lingered among them, a current of expectation. They hadn't forgotten what had happened yesterday, how Daniels had stood after being thrown down. Neither had Keller. The sergeant stalked the yard like a predator denied its kill. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, and his eyes scanned the recruits with a sharper edge than usual. He was restless, unsettled, his authority bruised. He had to restore it. And he knew exactly how. "Daniels!" he barked. Her name cracked through the morning air like thunder. She stepped forward, boots snapping against the dirt. Her body ached, but her face gave nothing away. "Yes, sir." Front and center, she obeyed, standing tall before him. The recruits watched, every breath held. Keller circled her like a hawk, eyes narrowed. "Yesterday you thought you proved something, didn't you?" he said, voice low and dangerous. "No, sir, don't lie to me. You stood there, staring me down like you'd won. You think because you can take a little dirt and sweat that you belong here?" She didn't move, didn't blink. "I think I can endure, sir." "Endure," he repeated, his lip curling. "We'll see about that." Without warning, Keller lunged. His hand shot forward, aiming for her shoulder like before, intending to yank her off balance and send her sprawling again. But Daniels wasn't the same as yesterday. The moment his arm extended, she shifted. Her body twisted with sharp precision, stepping out of his grasp. She caught his wrist, not with brute force, but with practiced technique, and pivoted. His momentum carried him forward, off balance. His boots slipped in the dust. For the first time in front of the recruits, Keller stumbled. A gasp rippled through the formation. Daniels released him immediately, stepping back into place, hands at her sides, eyes front. She hadn't attacked, hadn't resisted an order. She had simply redirected his aggression. Keller froze, his breath caught in his throat. Humiliation seared through him like fire. He had meant to show dominance, but instead, he'd been made a fool of by the very recruit he wanted to break. The recruits whispered, "Did you see that?" One muttered. She moved like she knew it was coming. Their voices trembled with awe. Keller's face darkened. He straightened his shoulders, jaw tight. Again, he barked. This time, he struck faster, lunging with greater force. But Daniels anticipated him. She sidestepped smoothly, letting his own weight carry him forward. Dust sprayed as his boots slid. His balance faltered again, and though she could have exploited it further, she didn't. She simply stood firm, her silence louder than any defiance. The recruits' whispers swelled. Respect glimmered in their eyes, not for Keller, but for her. "Enough!" Keller roared, his voice cracking with fury. Silence dropped heavy over the yard. His chest heaved, rage boiling under his skin. He wanted to lash out, to reassert dominance, but he couldn't ignore what had just happened. Twice he had gone for her. Twice she had countered without violence, without insubordination. And twice she had left him humiliated. Danielle stood calm, her uniform dirty, her body tired, but her spirit steady. She hadn't smiled. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't even looked him in the eye. Her restraint only deepened the sting. Keller turned sharply, pacing in front of the recruits. "What you just saw," he barked, "was not skill. It was luck. Nothing more." No one believed him. He could feel it in their silence, see it in their posture. They were straighter now, sharper, inspired by her example. His words fell flat against the truth they had all witnessed. Daniels had moved with control, with precision, with training that didn't come from luck. "Discipline," Keller shouted, voice straining to reclaim dominance. "Discipline is what keeps you alive, not luck, not tricks." Still, the recruit's eyes slid toward Daniels, and Keller knew he was losing them. He stopped, turning back to her. "Daniels," he snapped, "you think you're clever? That you can make a fool out of me?" She met his glare calmly. "No, sir." "And what was that?" he demanded, his voice cutting. Her answer was steady, her tone respectful. "Control, sir." The word hit harder than a punch. Control, not rebellion, not arrogance. Just control. And worse, it was true. She hadn't disobeyed. She hadn't fought back. She had simply controlled herself, her movement, and by extension, the situation. The recruits knew it. Keller knew it. And that truth twisted inside him like a blade. He stepped closer, towering over her, his face red with anger. "You think control makes you strong? You think it makes you better than the rest?" "No, sir," Daniel said, voice low but clear. "It makes me ready." A ripple ran through the recruits. They heard it, felt it, and carried it in their chests. For the first time, they saw someone stand against Keller without raising a fist, without breaking the rules and win. Keller's fists clenched. His pride was bleeding in the dirt. He wanted to shout, to punish, to crush her spirit once and for all. But every word he might have spoken would only deepen his loss. She hadn't broken discipline. She hadn't stepped out of line. And the more he pushed, the more the recruits would side with her. For the first time, Sergeant Keller realized he was trapped. He barked the only command he could manage without admitting defeat. "Back in line." Daniel snapped to attention, turned, and marched back into formation. Her movements were crisp, her posture tall, her silence unshakable. The recruits' eyes followed her, their respect silent but undeniable. She didn't look at them, didn't bask in their admiration. She simply stood, one of them, no higher, no lower. But they knew the truth. They had seen the counter. They had seen control. And they would not forget it. Keller turned away, his face flushed, his chest heaving with fury he couldn't release. He had been humiliated, not by rebellion, not by insubordination, but by discipline itself, the very thing he preached. And that humiliation cut deeper than anything else. The barracks were never quiet at night, but that evening a different kind of noise filled the space. It wasn't the usual groans of aching muscles, or the muttered curses about blistered feet. It was whispers, hushed, urgent, electric whispers that darted from bunk to bunk like sparks. "Did you see her?" One voice hissed. "She moved like she knew what he was going to do," another replied. "He didn't stand a chance." The sergeant actually stumbled. The memory replayed in every recruit's mind, the moment Keller lunged, the dust rising, Daniel stepping aside with precision, and the unthinkable the sergeant stumbling like a rookie. It was a sight none of them had imagined possible. Daniels lay on her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her body racked with exhaustion. She could feel their eyes on her, even when they didn't speak. Admiration, curiosity, respect. It weighed on her shoulders, almost as much as the day's drills had. She hadn't done it for recognition. She had done it because it was the only way to stay standing. But in their eyes, it had become something bigger. And in Keller's eyes, it had become something unforgivable. The next morning, the yard hummed with a strange tension. The recruits assembled with sharper posture, rifles aligned with unusual precision. Their bodies were battered, but their spirits carried a new kind of steel. Keller knew it the moment he stepped onto the field. He saw it in their eyes, not the dull fear he was accustomed to, but something alive, something dangerous. They weren't broken. They weren't cowed. They were inspired, and he knew exactly who was responsible. His gaze slid to Daniels, standing tall in formation. Dust still clung to the creases of her boots, her uniform no cleaner than anyone else's. Yet somehow she stood apart. She hadn't asked for the attention, hadn't sought it, but she carried it now like a banner she hadn't chosen. "Listen up," Keller barked, voice sharper than usual. "Yesterday was a disgrace. One of you thought it clever to make a fool of me. Let me be clear, there are no heroes here. Only soldiers. And soldiers follow orders." His glare lingered on Daniels as the words sank in. But instead of breaking, the recruits straightened their backs. They didn't cheer, didn't smile, but their silence told him all he needed to know. His words were losing weight. Keller forced them into drills, harder than ever. Push-ups until elbows buckled, sprints until legs quaked, crawling under barbed wire until skin tore. He pushed them mercilessly, determined to grind that spark of belief out of their bones. But the spark refused to die. Every time Daniel's body faltered, she pushed again. Every time dirt filled her mouth, she spat it out and kept moving. And every time she rose, the recruits rose with her, their resolve hardening in quiet solidarity. Keller could see it spreading. He could feel control slipping through his fingers. By evening, the camp mess hall was alive with low murmurs. Trays clattered, spoons scraped, but beneath it all ran the same undercurrent of whispers. "She's not afraid of him. She made him stumble twice. It's not luck. She knows what she's doing." Daniels sat quietly at a corner table, spooning food into her mouth without looking up. She didn't feed the whispers, didn't acknowledge them. She only ate, body screaming for rest, heart aching from the burden of attention. She hadn't asked to lead anyone. She only wanted to survive the training. But survival had turned her into a symbol, whether she liked it or not. Keller watched from across the hall, his fork clenched in his fist. His recruits were slipping away, not from his orders, but from his influence. And the worst part was that Daniels hadn't said a word, hadn't broken a rule. She had humiliated him not with rebellion, but with discipline itself. It festered inside him like poison. That night, rain began to fall, drumming against the barracks roof. The recruits lay in their bunks, some asleep, some whispering, some staring into the dark. Daniels lay awake, listening to the storm. Her body ached, but her mind churned with heavier weight. She hadn't planned for any of this. She hadn't wanted to be a symbol, hadn't wanted the sergeant's wrath to zero in on her. But she knew now there was no turning back. Every move she made was being watched, not just by Keller, but by every recruit in the yard. If she faltered, they would falter. If she stood, they would stand. The realization both strengthened and terrified her. Keller lay awake too, though in his private quarters, his anger boiling hotter with every clap of thunder. His authority was slipping, and he couldn't afford it. If recruits began believing they could stand taller than him, everything unraveled. Discipline wasn't just drills and rules, It was fear. It was control. And control was something Daniels was stealing from him with every breath she took. He told himself it wasn't personal, but deep down he knew it was. She hadn't just challenged him, she had humiliated him. In front of everyone. Twice. And humiliation to Keller was an unforgivable crime. The next day, the shockwaves continued. During weapons training, recruits glanced at Daniels for reassurance. During endurance drills, when exhaustion pressed them to the ground, they found themselves thinking of her rising from the dirt, and somehow they pushed harder. Even those who had doubted her before, who had sneered at the idea of a woman lasting in Keller's world, now held their tongues. She had earned something Keller could never command: respect. Keller saw it all. Every look, every whisper, every spark of admiration. And each one was a knife, twisting deeper. The shockwaves weren't just in the ranks anymore. They were in him. By week's end, the training yard was no longer Keller's alone. He barked the same orders, cracked the same insults, pushed them through the same punishments. But the air had changed. It wasn't his voice that kept them moving anymore. It was Daniel's example. Every stumble reminded them of her rise. Every failure was met with the thought of her silent defiance. And every blow Keller tried to land only reminded them of the counter that had shaken him. Daniel still said nothing, still refused to play the hero. She bore the weight quietly, her body breaking and healing day after day. But no matter how silent she was, the recruits carried her story like a flame. And Keller, for all his fury, could do nothing to extinguish it. The sky above the training yard was iron gray, clouds heavy with the threat of another storm. The recruits lined up in silence, rifles pressed to their shoulders, boots rooted into the ground. The air carried something tense, something sharp. They weren't just waiting for drills. They were waiting for the next move in a battle none of them had chosen, but all of them could feel. Sergeant Keller stalked the perimeter like a wolf pacing its cage. His jaw was set, his eyes hard, but the lines at the corners of his mouth betrayed him. The stumble, the whispers, the counter, all of it had carved away at the armor of his authority. And though he shouted the same commands, though he wore the same mask, the recruits saw through it now. They saw cracks. And at the center of it all stood Daniels. She was no different in appearance from the others, her fatigues soaked with sweat, her boots caked with mud, her hands raw from training. But there was something about the way she carried herself. She didn't slouch. She didn't grimace. She didn't let the weight of Keller's fury bow her shoulders. Even in silence, she stood tall. It was that silence that unnerved Keller the most. She hadn't mocked him, hadn't spoken a word out of turn. She had humiliated him with nothing but discipline, with control, with a refusal to break. "Down!" Keller barked. The recruits dropped into push-up position, arms quaking. Daniels hit the ground with the rest, her palms biting into the dirt. Her body ached from days of punishment, but she pressed up steadily, her movements crisp, precise. Keller prowled among them, shouting, counting, pushing until faces turned red and muscles screamed. "Faster! Stronger!" "You call that effort?" His voice cracked through the air, but it no longer carried the same bite. Because every time a recruit thought of giving up, every time exhaustion threatened to pin them down, they thought of Daniels rising from the dirt, defying the fall. And so they pushed harder, not for Keller, but for themselves. Keller saw it. He saw how their eyes weren't on him anymore. They were on her. Rage boiled in his chest. He stopped in front of Daniels, his shadow falling over her. "You," he spat. "You think you're better than the rest? You think your tricks make you strong?" She didn't look at him. She finished another push-up, steady as ever, then locked her arms at the top, her gaze fixed straight ahead. "I don't think anything, sir," she said quietly. Her words were calm, respectful, but they struck him harder than a fist. She wasn't claiming victory. She wasn't defying him. She was simply refusing to break. And in that refusal, she stood taller than he ever could. Keller's fists clenched. He wanted to drag her to her feet, to throw her down again, to prove to everyone watching that he was still the storm. But he knew deep down, bitterly, that it wouldn't matter. She would rise again, and every rise was another nail in the coffin of his authority. "On your feet," he barked to the entire squad. The recruits scrambled upright, rifles to their chests. Daniels moved with them, swift, precise. Her silence filled the yard like a drumbeat, steady and unshakable. Keller paced in front of them, breathing hard. He needed to reassert control, to crush this symbol she had become. Yet the harder he pushed, the stronger she seemed. The more he punished, the more the recruits admired her resilience. It was a battle he was losing, not in the dirt, but in their hearts. And that loss was unbearable. That evening, the storm finally broke. Rain poured across the camp, drumming against tin roofs, soaking the training yard into a swamp of mud and grit. The recruits ran drills through it, slipping and stumbling, their uniforms plastered to their skin. Keller drove them harder, shouting until his throat burned. But through the sheets of rain, one figure rose again and again, falling, rising, steady, relentless. Daniels moved like the storm itself could not touch her. Mud smeared across her face. Rain blinded her eyes, but she never faltered. The recruits saw it. And though their lungs burned and their muscles screamed, they mirrored her, pushing through the storm with renewed strength. By the time Keller dismissed them, every recruit was soaked to the bone, mud clinging to their bodies like armor. They staggered toward the barracks, exhausted but alive with something new pride. And Keller stood alone in the rain, fists tight at his sides, the taste of defeat bitter on his tongue. Later that night, in the barracks, the whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, low but certain, speaking not with awe, but with belief. She doesn't give up. She's the one holding us together. She's proof we can outlast him. Daniels sat on her bunk, peeling wet socks from her feet, her body heavy with exhaustion. She didn't respond to the words around her, didn't encourage them, didn't bask in them. She only sat in silence, her thoughts heavy, her spirit steady. But she knew the truth now as well as they did. Something had shifted. The squad no longer followed Keller's voice. They followed resilience. They followed the example of standing, of rising, of control. And though she had never asked for it, she had become their symbol. Keller couldn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his quarters, staring at the rain streaking down the window, his reflection fractured by the drops. His authority was slipping, and he knew it. He had built his rule on fear, on dominance, on breaking recruits down until they were his to shape. But Daniels had refused to break. Worse, she had done it silently. If she had shouted, if she had rebelled, if she had tried to rally the others, he could have crushed her openly, punished her into submission. But silence left him no target. Her discipline had outmatched his. Her control had humiliated him in front of everyone. And now, no matter how loudly he shouted, no matter how harshly he punished, the recruits no longer feared him. They respected her. For Keller, that was the deepest wound of all. The silent victory was complete. Not with cheers, not with triumph, not even with recognition. It was in the unshakable resolve of one soldier, standing tall where others would have stayed down. It was in the way she carried herself through the storm, through the dirt, through the weight of every blow he had thrown. It was in the fact that she had beaten him without ever fighting him. And though Keller would never admit it, not to her, not to the recruits, not even to himself, he knew. He had lost. Morning broke with a rare stillness. The storm had passed, leaving the training yard soaked in puddles and streaks of mud that glistened beneath the pale sunlight. The recruits marched out of the barracks, boots squelching as they formed ranks. Their uniforms clung damp to their bodies, but their eyes were clear, sharper than they had ever been. Sergeant Keller emerged moments later. His cap was pulled low, his jaw tight, his usual swagger stiffened into something forced. He barked the same commands as always, his voice sharp and clipped. But beneath the bark, there was a hollowness the recruits could feel. He no longer filled the yard. Instead, the weight of the morning rested on Daniels. She hadn't sought it, hadn't asked for it, but she carried it nonetheless. Her body was battered, her muscles still sore from the storm drills, but her spirit remained steady. She moved with precision, every step deliberate, every breath controlled. She wasn't louder. She wasn't faster. She wasn't stronger than everyone else. But she was unshakable, and that made all the difference. Keller pushed them hard again that day, as though sheer force could erase what had taken root. Rifle drills, sprints through the mud, crawling under barbed wire until their uniforms tore. He barked until his throat went raw, but the recruits no longer drew strength from his commands. They drew it from Daniels. When someone stumbled, they remembered her rising. When mud filled their mouths, they thought of her spitting dirt and standing again. When exhaustion pulled at their limbs, they matched her steady pace, refusing to falter. It was no longer fear that drove them. It was resilience. Keller saw it happening and felt powerless to stop it. His voice cracked across the yard, but every time Daniels kept moving, the recruits followed her instead of him. She had become the anchor he could never be, and that truth gnawed at him with every passing hour. By midday, the recruits were bent with fatigue, their breaths ragged in the thick, humid air. Keller ordered them into formation, his eyes sweeping a line. "You think this is strength?" He shouted. "You think dragging yourselves through the mud makes you ready for what's waiting out there?" He jabbed a finger toward the distant horizon, where trees swayed under the fresh wind. "Out there, no one's going to care how many times you stand up. They'll make sure you stay down. You think endurance will save you? It won't. Discipline will. Obedience will. My orders will." The words echoed across the yard, but the recruits didn't shift. They didn't bow their heads. They didn't avert their eyes. They stood straighter, taller, their silence unified, their posture unbroken. And Keller knew. He wasn't speaking to them anymore. They weren't listening. Daniels said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence had become the loudest voice in the yard. She had proven more with her actions than Keller ever could with his commands. Every scar on her palms, every bruise hidden beneath her sleeves, every streak of dirt on her uniform was testimony to the truth that none of them could deny. You can be thrown down. You can taste the dirt. But what defines you is whether you rise again. That was the lesson etched into the mud beneath their boots, carved into the memory of every recruit who had watched her stand. When the day finally ended, the recruits trudged back toward the barracks. Their bodies screamed, but their spirits carried something new, something Keller couldn't take from them. They spoke little, but when their eyes met, there was recognition. A shared understanding. A quiet bond forged not by Keller's discipline, but by Daniel's resilience. And she, walking among them, felt the weight of it. She hadn't asked for leadership. She hadn't wanted to stand above anyone else. But leadership had found her, not in shouts, not in rank, but in example. That realization both humbled and strengthened her. Keller lingered on the training yard long after they were gone. The mud glistened in the fading light, and the silence pressed heavy on his chest. He told himself it wasn't over, that he could still break her, still reclaim control. But deep down, beneath layers of pride and anger, he knew the truth. He had lost, not in a fight, not in an argument, but in something far more lasting. He had lost their respect. And respect was a currency no sergeant could afford to run dry. His authority would remain by title, by regulation, by the system that demanded obedience. But in their hearts, he had already been replaced by Daniels. Weeks later, the story of that moment still lingered in whispers. New recruits who hadn't been there heard it from those who had. Around bunks in the mess hall, during long nights of guard duty, the tale spread. The sergeant threw her down, they said, but she rose, again and again, and in the end, he couldn't touch her. It became more than a story. It became a lesson, a reminder that the dirt wasn't the end, that the measure of a soldier or any person wasn't in how many times they fell, but in how many times they rose. Daniels never sought recognition. She never repeated the story herself. She simply carried on training, enduring, rising each time the world tried to throw her down. But whether she liked it or not, she had become more than a recruit. She had become a symbol. For Keller, the humiliation never faded. It lingered like a scar he couldn't hide, etched deeper than the lines on his face. And though he never spoke of it, though he carried on barking orders and driving drills, he knew. Every time his eyes met hers, he knew. She had beaten him, not with rebellion, not with defiance, but with silence, discipline, and the unbreakable will to rise. The training ground would see countless drills, countless storms, countless soldiers thrown into the dirt. But for those who had stood there, for those who had witnessed that day, one image would never fade. A young recruit, battered and filthy, rising from the ground with fire in her eyes. A sergeant, proud and unyielding, left humiliated not by words, but by the strength he could not crush. And the lesson etched in dust and mud: you may be thrown down, but rising makes you unstoppable.